Hey guys, what's going on? Mr. H here again. Today we're shooting another video. This one we're talking about the carbon cycle. Okay, this one's pretty cool, so let's just go ahead and jump into it. All right, first thing we gotta talk about, before we talk about the carbon cycle, what the heck is carbon? Great question. Carbon is like an atom, guys. So if you've ever seen the periodic table of elements, you got hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, all those things are atoms. They're kind of like these small building blocks that build everything else, build molecules that build bigger things, right? You can usually go smaller than an atom. You could talk about protons and neutrons and stuff, but atoms are really microscopic, really small, really small, right? Smaller than a cell. Remember, cells are living things. Atoms are not a living thing, so carbon's not alive, right? So what the carbon cycle, guys, is, it's the cycle or the process of transferring carbon through different reservoirs. So we're going to write that down and kind of explain what that means, right? So the carbon cycle is the process, the process of transferring carbon through different reservoirs on Earth, the place we call home. All right, so what the carbon cycle is the process of transferring that atom, that carbon atom, all around the Earth through different reservoirs. So reservoirs, guys, is a key term we're going to talk about. So what is a reservoir? A reservoir is just a place where you store things, store stuff, right? So if you ever were driving or something and maybe you saw, like, it's not really a lake, but there's like this big area that's holding a bunch of water and it's like, oh, this is a water reservoir. It's just storing water, right? Reservoirs, when we're talking about the carbon cycle, are just places that store carbon, right? And there's 4 reservoirs we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the atmosphere, lithosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, right? 4 of them. Carbon can be in any of those places, right? So that was quick, but I'll tell you more about it. So let's do the definition of a reservoir real quick. A reservoir, okay, is a place where compounds are stored. Place where compounds are stored. Okay, just hold stuff. So I'm even gonna write that down. It's just a place that holds stuff. Holds stuff. Hold stuff. All right, so the carbon cycle is how carbon transfers through those 4 reservoirs, which I mentioned. I'll go back to them in a minute. And remember, guys, this is so phenomenal. This is a crazy idea, is the conservation of mass, right? Nothing's created or destroyed, just gets recycled or transformed. Same thing with carbon, right? We're carbon-based life forms. When we die, what happens to that carbon? Let's talk about it, all right? So, boom. Check out this drawing I got for you today, okay? If you notice, here's land. Okay, this is my land, and then we're going to the ocean over here. There are 4 reservoirs I mentioned, right? I wrote them up here. The first reservoir is called the atmosphere. The second reservoir is called the hydrosphere. Third reservoir is called the biosphere. And the fourth reservoir is called the lithosphere. Okay, all of these are just places where carbon can be found, right? So let's start with number 1. Let's start with the atmosphere, right? What is the atmosphere? It's just that big bubble that surrounds the Earth, keeps all the gases and everything in here, and it keeps things from escaping into space, right? Keeps all the oxygen and everything we need to breathe in here, right? So the atmosphere is really important. It's that bubble around the Earth. So the atmosphere, okay, this bubble surrounding Earth, bubble surrounding Earth. And when carbon is in the atmosphere, okay, we're talking about the air, we're talking about gases, guys. We're talking about the gas, right? So we're not talking about oxygen. There's no carbon in oxygen. So what is carbon? What form is carbon in when it's in the atmosphere? It's a gas, but more specifically, it's CO2, carbon dioxide, right? You've heard that before. In the air, it's CO2, it's carbon dioxide. So when carbon is in the atmosphere, it's stored as a gas. Carbon is stored as a gas in the atmosphere. And what specific gas is it going to be? CO2, that's right. So it's going to be CO2, okay? So in the atmosphere, it's going to be stored as CO2, carbon dioxide. So this is called carbon dioxide, right? CO2. So I'm going to erase it and just put it down underneath, right? Stored as CO2 in the atmosphere. right? But carbon's not just found in the atmosphere, right? It can also be in the ocean. It can be carbonic acid in the ocean. So how does it get through all these different reservoirs, right? What are the processes that bring it from the atmosphere and put it into the hydrosphere, or put it into the biosphere, put it into the lithosphere? We'll talk about those in a minute, but first, sorry, I get ahead of myself. Let's just do the different reservoirs. So that's the atmosphere. Carbon can also be found in the hydrosphere, right? The hydrosphere is hydro, means water. So this should be a simple one. Hydro just means water. So these are bodies of water that store carbon. So hydro equals water. So then that means the hydrosphere are bodies of water. Bodies? Spell that right? Yeah. Bodies of water that store carbon, right? So the ocean is going to be a really big reservoir. It's going to store a lot of that carbon that can be taken out of the atmosphere, right? So that's hydrosphere. Then we've got the biosphere. I'm actually going to write it down here because I don't have a lot of room. So the biosphere, bio, what's bio mean again? That's right, it means life. So the biosphere is going to be living things, right, that store carbon. So bio means life. So these are living things that store carbon. Remember I said we're carbon-based life force? We got carbon in our body, guys. We got lots of carbon. Trees have carbon. All living things have some carbon in their bodies, right? So living things that store carbon. All living things are part of the biosphere, right? And then the last one we have is called the lithosphere. Lithosphere. So the lithosphere is actually the ground, right? You can think of it as the ground, layers of the earth, soil, right? You can also find carbon in the dirt, more or less, right? In the ground. So you find carbon in the dirt. You can find it as fossil fuels. And we'll come back to that, all right? So those are the 4 reservoirs where we can find carbon. But how do we get carbon from one reservoir to another, right? What are the processes? Well, let's go from the atmosphere to the hydrosphere. If carbon's in CO2 here, how can we transform? Remember, it's not disappearing, it's just going somewhere else. If we want to take carbon from the atmosphere and put it into the hydrosphere, you got to do that. Usually there's 2 ways. One way is through diffusion, right? It just kind of dissolves into water. The second way is through photosynthesis. We've learned about photosynthesis. Remember, it takes carbon dioxide and makes oxygen. So these little green guys here are phytoplankton, right? And they're going to do photosynthesis and bring in CO2 and convert it into something else and just recycle it and change it into something else, right? So you can take it out of the atmosphere by photosynthesis or diffusion. So what I'm going to do, guys, is I'm going to color code here. There are 2 vocab words. There's sources. A source is any process that takes CO2 out of the atmosphere or carbon out of the atmosphere. And a sink, I'm sorry, messed that up. A sink is anything that takes it out of the atmosphere, and a source is anything that puts it into the atmosphere. So I'll say it one more time because I messed up the first time. A sink is anything that takes CO2 or carbon out of the atmosphere, and a source is anything that puts it into the atmosphere. So I'm going to write sources in red today. All right, and I'm going to write sinks in green. The sink will be in green. All right, so our first sink, taking carbon out of the atmosphere, here's my arrow, whoop, into the hydrosphere, is going to be diffusion. Right, that's diffusion. That's just dissolving into the ocean. And there's also a second sink here, right, of our phytoplankton. What are they doing? They're doing photosynthesis. So another one we got is photosynthesis. All right, so that's how you can get carbon out of the atmosphere and into the hydrosphere. 2 ways, right? 2 sinks. We got diffusion and photosynthesis. All right, but photosynthesis doesn't just happen in the ocean. We know plants do it on land. So let's do another sink. Here we go. Into the biosphere. Now we're going from carbon in the atmosphere into the living thing, a biosphere. It's going to be incorporated into these tissues, and that carbon is going to transform into something else, right? So remember, when it's in a human being, remember what C6H12O6 was when we were learning about photosynthesis? That's right, that's glucose. C6, what's that C? It's carbon, right? So it's changing. It's taking that C from the carbon dioxide and changing it into something else, changing it to glucose. So we're just transforming it, right? So we got another sink here. Whoop. Into our trees. This is again photosynthesis. Oh, excuse my writing. That's photosynthesis, right? But what's the opposite of photosynthesis? Cellular respiration, right? That's breathing. What am I releasing right now? I'm releasing carbon dioxide. Uh-oh. We are putting CO2 when we breathe, or any animals breathe, we're putting carbon back into the atmosphere, right? So here we have a source of carbon in the atmosphere. This is going to be called respiration. I gotta stand up for this so I can spell this clear for you guys. Respiration. Right? Remember, that's happening in the mitochondria, right? Cellular respiration. We're breathing out CO2. Right? Just breathe some out right now. Filling up the atmosphere, filling up the air. All right? So one way from the atmosphere into the biosphere is through photosynthesis. One way we release it is through respiration. So animals do that, but remember, plants also do respiration. So I can do another little arrow connecting here because they actually do respiration as well, usually at night. All right? And then let's talk about our last one over here, the lithosphere. So if you notice, this is my drawing of a cow, by the way. So here's a cow breathing, right? If I breathe, if a cow breathes, we're releasing carbon into the atmosphere. But what happens when this cow, or us, or you, what happens when we die? We decompose. Remember we learned about decomposers? So when we decompose, okay, some of that carbon that's in our bodies is going to go into the ground, into the lithosphere, and as they're decomposing, those bacteria and the decomposers are actually also releasing, oh sorry, this should be, I got a color code here, releasing carbon back in the atmosphere, so this is decomposition, right? But this guy can also become a fossil fuel, right? So when you die, when anything dies, and it gets buried over long periods of time, there's a ton of pressure on top of that animal. You give it millions and millions of years, that dead organism is going to become a fossil fuel. It's going to turn into coal and oil, right? So we got coal, oil. So I actually draw that here too, right? So this dead cow, or maybe you probably heard this before, when you fill up your gas tank, right, at the gas station, you're filling up your gas tank with ancient remains of dinosaurs. What? That's crazy. Yes, dinosaurs, because over millions of years ago, those dinosaurs died. They got piled up with a bunch of sediment, and then they started to break down, and under all that pressure, turned into coal and fossil fuels, right? So here's my coal and fossil fuels that we dig up out of the ground, right? Right? Maybe even some natural gas and things, right? And sometimes these things can also be turned into limestone as well. So you also find some limestone is going to have some carbon. Some limestone is going to have some carbon as well. All right, so we found out how you get from carbon out of the atmosphere. We know how you put it into the atmosphere through respiration, decomposition. But the biggest thing, the biggest process today that's putting so much carbon in our atmosphere is actually something called combustion. So this is probably our biggest source of carbon into the atmosphere. This is called combustion. Right? And what combustion is, it's the burning of fossil fuels. So burning fossil fuels. Right? And this is a big deal today, guys, because I'm sure you guys have heard all over the news about climate change, right? And climate change is really because there's too much CO2 in the atmosphere, right? This is one reservoir. We can't have all the carbon in one reservoir, right? If we put carbon into the atmosphere, it's a greenhouse gas and it traps a lot of heat, warming up our planet, which can kind of change our climate. So we don't want a ton of CO2 in our atmosphere. So we got to think about ways, how do we get that CO2 out of the atmosphere? You can do it through photosynthesis, right? You want to get it out of there. So some people say plant a bunch of trees, or there's iron fertilization in the ocean, which means that you feed these plankton to get really big plankton or algae blooms to do photosynthesis. These are different ideas people are thinking. How do we get that CO2 out of the ocean? Out of the atmosphere? One way is through photosynthesis, right? And that's maybe perhaps an idea of how we can kind of slow down climate change. But guys, climate change is because there's too much CO2 in the atmosphere. And that really started, climate has always been warming and cooling. There's been ice ages and everything, but it's really the rate of speed, right? And we're thinking we're speeding up the climate change so fast because of combustion. Since the Industrial Revolutions, which we talked about in another video in 1850, right? That's when we kind of came up with the combustion engine, all these things, all these factories. That's when we started to burn things to make goods, right? And create energy. So the lights in this room I'm using right now, I'm plugging into a wall that's burning energy somewhere to create that electricity and that energy. That's probably through some form of combustion. And as that's happening, we're putting CO2 into the atmosphere, right? So the carbon cycle is kind of the fundamentals, but this leads to bigger implications about global warming and climate change. All right, guys, so we talked about the atmosphere, the different reservoirs which carbon can be found in. Remember, carbon's not created or destroyed, which is crazy. Remember we talked about the dinosaurs as fossil fuels. The carbon that was in them is now on the ground, and then we're burning it and putting it in the atmosphere, and then it's gonna recycle, right? Nothing's created or destroyed, just gets recycled, gets transformed. So you can find carbon either in the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, biosphere, living things, or in the ground in the lithosphere, right? And it's gonna switch and change and transform over time, right? So that's the carbon cycle related to climate change and global warming. Work hard, get smart, and I'll see you guys next time.